I still remember the day they took my father away. It was a Monday night. We were having a family dinner. The first sound we heard was a loud knock on the door, which turned into a kick and ended up in a door broken into pieces. Two tall men that looked like soldiers took him by force while my mother cried desperately, yelling for help. I never imagined that would be the last time I ever saw him. You might be wondering, why did this happen? What was going on? Here's the story behind my father's disappearance. Chile, 1970. Salvador Allende was elected as President of the Republic. He co-founded the Socialist Party, became the first Marxist president in Latin America through open elections. Many say he was a good man that was going to bring Chile to its prosperity. Others say he was the man who caused Chile to be divided in two and fade into economic crisis. When Allende got the presidential power after losing 3 times in Chile, he did indeed face an economic crisis along with other challenges. The socialists, because of the laws in Chile at the time, came into power with a majority of the votes, but not more than half. Today, second-round elections exist in Chile so that over half of the population is benefited with the president-elect. Since Allende came into power with only 36% of the votes, there were many conflicts during his presidency, as not many people agreed with the socialist government. Allende was a socialist governor. He believed in many ideals that sound perfect but are extremely hard to play out in real life. As soon as he came into power, he began implementing a platform that called out for transforming Chile into a fully socialist country. This platform was called the Chilean path to socialism. This path to socialism meant that there were going to be many changes in the way the country worked. Change tends to worry people. Change is a scary thing, and fear spreads quickly. This is probably why, after only 3 years in office, the Chilean military overthrew the government, implementing the military regime. The Chilean path to socialism included the nationalism of Chile's large-scale industries, mainly copper mining and banking. Also, Allende believed that the government should take care of the health system the people receive, making it equal for everyone. The program also meant having free milk for kids in schools across the country, as well as a government-provided education for all. So far, all sounds great, right? But the problem is that for these great things to be possible, money has to be available for the government to actually set the ideas out. This is where the division of Chile began to arise and discontent grew. Land and goods began to be redistributed by the government equally amongst the Chilean people. This meant that land, goods, and businesses owned by the rich were taken by the government. Of course, the people that belonged to the highest social classes weren't too excited about this. The money that this produced was going right into the people. But the rich people didn't feel a positive change because they felt they were being treated unfairly. This money helped build 120,000 residential buildings and gave 3,000 scholarships to Chile's native peoples. Social security was available to all workers. A minimum wage was put in place and many public works were put into action. In 1971, Chile re-established relations with Cuba, turning its back to American ideals. Quickly, the people of Chile began to react to the fast-pacing change in the country. The anger of a great portion of the country reached its peak 3 years after Allende's election. August 23, 1973. Augusto Pinochet was named commander of the Chilean army by Salvador Allende himself. For his clearly years, he aspired to a military career. It was said that Pinochet was never interested in politics. He was not interested in the political events that denominated civilian society. But Pinochet was firmly convinced that political Marxism was disruptive, hypocritical, and incompatible with, in his words, the moral principles that should uphold society. He became skeptical of the ability of Chile's democratic system to withstand Marxism. The presidential events in 1970 confirmed his deep suspicions, for it gave power to the Marxist Allende, despite the fact that he was a minority candidate. This led to him being the face in the spotlight of the Chilean coup. 43 years ago, on September 11, 1973, Chile's socialist president was overthrown in a US-backed coup by Augusto Pinochet. This occurred after the Congress accused Allende of anti-constitutional practices. But Pinochet became power-hungry and decided to stay in power through force. During his regime, he was the leader and man of approval of many changes in the country after Allende. He turned the economic system around to a capitalist one, ended the shortage of food, and ended economic despair in Chile. But the way he achieved this was horrifying. He aimed to eliminate everyone that thought differently of him. He violated human rights and didn't hesitate to do so. The very commonly known right wing, in addition to both center and far, are defined as groups that presuppose tradition as an existentialist ahistorical entity and preserving or receiving it. The right wing is made up of radicals, but not necessarily a group of extremists. In Chile, the wing was mainly characterized by their anti-communist stance, the favoring of hierarchical survival strategies, and the opposition to class struggle. The right wing generally was against the imposition of equality by the state, which favored individual justice over social justice. In addition, they support very different gender roles when it comes to women and men. Women are defined mainly as their role as mothers, since they rejected feminist claims. 10 years prior to the national protest, Pinochet's anti-communism as well as free market economic policies won him full support coming from middle-class Chileans and politicians. This was partly achieved with the use of terror, since 3,000 Allende supporters had been missing or murdered. In the early 1980s, there was a recession, and the copper prices declined radically, which took away the country's prosperity. The Chilean citizens belonging to the middle and working class, in addition to the leftists, rallied into a strike led by the Copper Miners' Union. For the following 3 years, many opposition groups joined to organize days of protest to find a way to reach democracy once again. In addition to monthly strikes, all of the student groups, women groups, and human rights organizations used many methods such as school boycotts and work slowdowns to demand democracy. When in power, Pinochet instituted many reforms to try to fix and improve the Chilean nation, which had been left in a deep economic, social, and political and constitutional crisis. According to Hoover Institution, Pinochet's regime brought political stability and economic improvement to Chile during its time in power between the years 1973 and 1990. The innovations in economic and social policy of the Pinochet government had significant influences on the governments in not only Chile, but the rest of Latin America. Today, a big part of the globe relies on markets more than in 1973. According to Hoover Institution, Pinochet's government put in place the new set of market-oriented policies, as well as structures that have remained as the foundation of Chile's economics and social development. A clear example of Pinochet's great contributions includes the regulation of domestic banks in the early 1980s, after being deregulated in the 1970s. In addition, with the help of Pinochet's targeted social programs, poverty levels as high as 50% in 1984 were radically reduced to 34% by the year 1989. The dictatorship that was under the power of Pinochet in 1973 is known for being one of the most aggressive coups in Latin America. Pinochet had practically turned Santiago, the capital city of Chile, into a giant torture camp. The Chilean capital quickly became the modern vision of hell. Students, politicians, homeless people were sent into torture centers. At the height of repression, over 60 torture centers were used in the capital city alone. The most famous one, the International Soccer Stadium, was and still is the place where the most human rights violations occurred in Chile. Many say that Pinochet was the scariest dictator out of all the dictatorships occurring in Latin America at the time. He was known as the CIA-backed, corrupt, modernist, fascist, military strongman. If he didn't like you or your ideals, he would send the death squad, the caravan of death, over for a visit. He had a secret police, the DINA, where they taught torturing skills. He destroyed his victims' corpses. Up until today, there are 1,000 bodies that are still officially missing in Chile. Their families are unsure whether they are alive or dead. So I think we have established that human rights were violated and abused. The number of direct victims of human rights violations in Chile account for at least 35,000, 28,000 tortured, 2,279 executed, and 1,248 missing, according to the National Commission on Political Imprisonment and Torture. In addition, some 200,000 people suffered exile, and an unknown number went through clandestine centers and illegal detention. The human rights violations committed under Pinochet's military regime included physical and sexual abuse, as well as psychological damage. So, were the human rights violations under Pinochet's dictatorship in 1973 worth the economic rise? Chile wouldn't be the country it is today without the 17 years of Pinochet's regime. We must keep in mind that Pinochet probably helped the country dodge two huge bullets. When he took over government, Chile was on the verge of a civil war and an intense economic crisis. Since the country was no longer backed by the U.S., basic provisions like bread and flour were scarce. Works of huge industries were going into strike, like truck drivers and copper miners. Members of the right wing sabotaged transport routes and energy lines. This weakened the economic system immensely and made the country split in two, right-wingers and left-wingers. Chile could predict disaster further into its path of socialism. When the right wing could no longer stand the socialist government it was falling onto, they decided to end it once and for all. They staged a coup, planned on taking Allende out of office by force, putting Pinochet into power, and once the calm was restored in Chile, cast a new round of elections. In the eyes of many, this seemed like the right thing to do. In this original plan, no one was hurt. Allende wasn't killed, and there were no political prisoners, people disappeared, or civilians exiled. What many of the supporters of the coup didn't predict was that a power-hungry Pinochet wouldn't leave office once he was put into power by the U.S. government, and that he would take his right-wing ideals to an extreme. During his military regime, Pinochet created the base for Chile to be today one of the wealthiest Latin American countries. But also, this was a consequence of the left-center governments that came after Pinochet, as well as the wealth of minerals in the country's territory. Besides, the only reason why a civil war was supposedly avoided in the right wing's point of view is because anyone who believed contrary to Pinochet's ideals was either executed, tortured, imprisoned, disappeared, or exiled. So there was no diversity of ideas to even suggest a civil war. So, the human rights violations under Pinochet's dictatorship in 1973 were not worth the economic rise he may have created. This is because generations of Chileans have and will be stained forever due to these violations. Mothers, sisters, brothers, fathers, grandmothers, aunts, grandfathers, and uncles still don't know where the bodies of many of their family members or friends are, if they were tortured or killed, raped or impregnated. I still remember when they took my father away. I still don't know where he is or what they did to him.
Las Fuerzas Armadas y de Orden han actuado en el día de hoy solo bajo la inspiración patriótica de sacar al país del caos que en forma aguda lo estaba precipitando el gobierno marxista de Salvador Allende.